So we are back from the screen and we are back live, and I'm happy to go and jump directly into the third session. I'm very happy to welcome Professor Carla Krolage here with us. She is a new professor at Regensburg, colleague for economic data science. But that sounds not really real estate, but the fact is she has been working on several aspects in real estate related. She's been working on tax issues. Well, she is an advisory board member for the finance ministry now, as I heard. And she has been also digging into workplaces and office places. So a data scientist can do many, many things. Carla has been working with the IFO Institute before. She has been working for McKinsey, so she knows the professional world, and she knows the research world, and now the university world back again. So she will talk about regulatory issues and how they impact real estate prices. Carla, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot for the kind introduction. Let me just share my slides. I'm really excited to talk to you all about your current research regarding regulation and taxation of German property prices. Like that, it sounds a bit dry, but if we jump in right away, if we look just at the current headlines, regulation and taxation for German real estate are all over the place. So rents have been rising quite a lot. There's lots of calls for regulation. You all know about the Berlin rent cap that was passed and then again declared unconstitutional. There are referendums on stabilizing rents, on nationalizing properties because of rents. At the same time, property prices have been falling again. But there's lots of calls for subsidies, for tax relief, and so on. So it is really at the heart of the current debate of how these subsidies work. And what I'm doing as a econ researcher that does this for the data science side is I want to really understand what these measures are doing, if the regulation is working or if the outcomes are completely different than intended. And to tell you that, doesn't always work out the way policy intended to be. And their data is great. So what I'm doing is I have property level price data from lots of different sources, such as F&B, ImmoScout, ImmoWelt. So it's really large scale data of the property market for many years. And I use several data science strategies to really identify what is the effect of a policy reform. Does a policy reform drive down prices, or do prices actually go up? And that is the field I'm working in. But to not bore you with theory, I'll start right with the three policy issues I'm going to talk about today. One back. The first one is real estate price subsidies, a second transfer taxes, and the third one rent regulations are the three main topics that are currently being discussed in current real estate policy. But let's just start right in with the institutions. I suppose not all of you are German, so for some of you this might be rather new, but the German state of Bavaria intended to make housing more affordable for families because until quite recently, prices were rising a lot. And in order to make houses more affordable, Bavaria introduced a flat rate subsidy, which basically meant that most households that purchased a house or a flat in Bavaria or built a house or a flat in Bavaria received 10,000 euros flat. The income thresholds were quite generous, so about 3/4 of households were eligible for the subsidy. So it was really substantial, and it was for every single owner-occupier purchasing a new house. There has been something else at the federal level, so-called Bautenegeld. This was contingent on having kids. But if you had a child or several children, you got 1,200 euros per child in year for a period of 10 years as subsidy for purchasing a property. And Bavaria topped it up a bit even more. These subsidies are passed now. They're still being paid out, but the application window has closed. But there's a third subsidy that is in the same order of things. In the state of Hesse, they just introduced the so-called Hessengeld, which is very comparable. So it was a subsidy of 10,000 euros per buyer plus 5,000 euros per child spread across 10 years. and limited to the amount of real estate transfer taxes. So if you purchase a property, you basically get this because, well, unless the property price is really low, but other than that, it affects many, many other occupiers. And the big question is, this was intended to make housing more affordable. And what I did was to actually look at the data and have the data tell me what happened to property prices in Bavaria after the state of Bavaria introduced this. So to give you a brief insight of how we researchers do stuff like that, because just looking at aggregate statistics won't help disentangle different channels that are going on. What I did is I looked at property data and I looked at comparable houses. So you only get the subsidy if your property is located in Bavaria. And assuming that trends are pretty similar on both sides of the border, so if you just move a couple of kilometers to the other side of the border, general trends like weather trends, regional development, jobs in the region, they're not changing too differently on both sides of the border. So what I did is I looked if there was a difference in the price development on the Bavarian side of the border once the subsidy was passed. And some of you might already understand what the effect might be. Actually, the subsidy did absolutely nothing to make houses more affordable. So if you look at the data, I can see that the moment the subsidy was introduced, the prices of single-family homes in Bavaria increased by pretty much exactly 10,000 euros, so the amount of subsidy more, than the prices on the other side of the border. Meaning that the subsidy is really fully shifted into house prices. It does not increase the affordability for families at all. But instead, if you're a seller of a house, that's great news for you. You know that every single family wanting to purchase a house, well, almost every single family, has 10,000 euros more to spare. So you know how you can increase your prices. That's what they did. And so the main beneficiary was not the families purchasing houses, but the sellers of houses. What's also interesting is this effect did not occur for apartments. Reason is you only get subsidy if you're an owner-occupier, and in these regions, houses are owner-occupied, apartments are not. So it really affects the market where you expect it to have an effect. And it's a really important takeaway if you look at Hesse, because the system is not that different in Hesse. And I'd much expect that we will see some development in prices in the state of Hesse now that there's a subsidy program implemented. So my takeaway from this is not as encouraging from a policy side. From a property developer side, of course, it's encouraging you can increase your prices, but it does not help in the overall scheme of things to increase affordability. Instead, if you're a policymaker and want to increase affordability, the best thing you can do is to incentivize construction, because having more properties will at the end make acquiring a property more affordable for families. If you have questions about that, feel free to jump in anytime, by the way. I'm happy to answer the questions because I'm jumping through a bunch of different policy reforms, and I'm happy to answer. But let me continue that to our second recent reform, which is also quite closely connected. Just to give you a background, if you're not German, in Germany, the real estate transfer tax, which has to be paid if you're buying a property, is set by the states. And until 2005, each state could have the same tax rate of 3.5%. Ever since, the states were free to set their tax rates, and they almost exclusively, with one exception, been increasing them. So here on the right-hand side, you see a map of the current tax rate. Bavaria is still at the 3.5% it started out at. Pretty much all other states have increased the taxes. Many states now have taxes of 6% or even slightly more. So this is quite a chunk of purchasing costs. This is also relevant because normally if you want to get a mortgage, you can't get a mortgage for the property tax. You have to pay it out of your assets. So if you're credit constrained, this property tax is an issue. And because this is a major cost, a major transaction cost of acquiring real estate, it's been constantly under big discussion. And there's again a current debate on, for example, exempting certain families from paying real estate transfer tax, exempting first-time home buyers from it, and to know whether this works, whether reducing the tax, because it, of course, impacts state revenues, and we're all, like all German levels of government are quite constrained at the moment, as you are probably all aware of. Lowering it is not fiscally easy because the states don't have many other sources of revenues where they can set their own tax rates, but it might make it easier to purchase a property. And to assess how this works, I looked at prices again. And that this here is the results. To give you some background, how do you understand this? The methodology that my co-authors and I are using is the states raise their tax rates at different points in time. Bavaria never raises the tax rate. Some other states do it every couple of years. And you can see whether property prices develop differently following a tax rate increase. That's a so-called event study, and that's what you see depicted in this graph. So you see the percentage change of property prices. The first red line is the point where the real estate transfer tax increase is announced. The dashed line is at the moment it was implemented, and after this red line, you have higher taxes. And you see the relative price development in states with a tax increase compared to what it would have been if it hadn't increased taxes. And effects are quite large. So what you see here is following a 1 percentage point increase in a real estate transfer tax rate, property prices in that state dropped on average by 3%. And for apartments, effects were even larger, meaning that investors respond more strongly than owner-occupiers, meaning that this time it's the sellers that bear this transfer tax. So why is the effect so large? Why is the effect larger than 1%? There are several reasons. The first one is what I just mentioned, that if you're credit constrained, if you get the maximum volume you can get out of the mortgage, and suddenly you have to pay taxes out of pocket, that's a problem. You can't pay as much anymore. So you can't afford the same house as you could afford before. This played a role. But another thing that plays a role is that tax increases mostly are here to stay. So for investors, now having to pay a tax means that if you want to sell the property again a couple of years down the road, the higher tax rate will again impact what you can sell the property for. So this transaction effect is priced in. What we can in fact see in our data is that properties that are subject to frequent transaction, they have a drop in prices following a tax increase is larger. So you have really strong effects. It's not impossible to imagine that the effects, if you lower the tax rate, would also go in a similar direction, namely if a tax increase leads to a substantial drop in tax property prices. Lowering the transfer tax rate likely also leads to an increase in property prices. So it's not that this is a direct translation to higher affordability if you lower it, but it's a bit more complex. And there's basically two channels at work. On the one hand, if real estate transfer tax was decreased, it actually may enable sellers to charge higher prices because you know that now people wanting to purchase your property can afford more. They don't have to afford this tax. They just have more options. So sellers have the option to increase the price accordingly because you can just sell it for more. At the same time, there is some effect on transacted quantities. So the price effect is not the one you imagine, but you have this pretty large price effect here. But at the same time, if the real estate transfer tax is reduced, this might increase transacted quantities, because more credit-constrained households can afford a mortgage, and there's less barriers to transactions, so actual sales might go up. Just the price effect is not as clear-cut. And if you thought about reforms on the policy side to increase transactional quantities and to make properties more affordable, I can imagine that more targeted reforms, meaning not a flat rate tax cut for everybody, but targeted reduction, for example, for first-time buyers, that might have slightly less adverse effects, but still you have the combination of these things going on, and the price effects are just pretty large. Okay. Again, if you have any question there, feel free to jump right in, because I'm now moving from purchase price subsidies and transfer taxes to rent regulation, which is quite possibly the thing that's been most talked about in Germany the last couple of years. For the non-Germans, to give you a bit more of an overview of what's happening or what has happened, is in 2020, Berlin wanted to curtail rising rents and implemented a law on rent limits in the housing sector, the so-called Berlin rent cap, which drastically cut down the rents you could charge. So first of all, there was a freeze on rent at a cutoff with previous state. And second, there was a calculation of the maximum rent you could charge, depending on the residential location, the construction year, and furnishing. But the rents you were still allowed to charge under this rent cap, they were really low. So there was some rents were almost halved. It was a tremendous impact on the rental market, because this capping was really substantially below the market level. There was just one major exemption, namely that new apartments built from 2014 onwards were exempt from the rent cap. So if you had recently built properties, you could just still charge the rent you want. For the older ones, you were drastically limited. And it's not only for new contract, but it also applied to all the contracts you had before. So this is a huge effect on returns that were drastically cut following this rent cap. But many landlords did was a two-factor pricing. So in new ads, you see quite frequently that there's a main rent and a second rent that's applicable once the rent cap is in effect. And the main rent was much higher. From the beginning, there was a big debate about whether this was constitutional, whether it was too much regulation. And then it turned out that the Constitutional Court declared this rent cap unconstitutional about a year after it went into effect, and then was dissolved. And ever since, there has been a lot of demand, especially from some people in Berlin, for it to return. And there were also major requests like a big referendum on socializing properties from large property companies, such as Deutsche Wohnen. And while the impact on regulated rents of this rent cap is quite clear, my team and I, we look at the effect of this on not only rents, but also on property prices. Let me start right away. What you see again is, a rent study. So you see several lines. First of all is the announcement of the rent cap. Second dashed vertical line is the point of time where it came to effect. And the third line, 2021, is when it became unconstitutional, was dissolved. You see the price development of two different segments here. On the left-hand side, the regulated segment, meaning properties built up to 2014, they're regulated, rents are cut drastically. So you also see in the property ad data that rents drop a lot following rent cap, but they recover fairly swiftly once the rent cap is declared unconstitutional. And what you see here, but I also find quite interesting, is that in 2023, the rents in Berlin have risen even more than in other cities. So this year basically compares developments in Berlin to developments in other cities. And while rents were much cheaper at the time the rent cap was in effect, they have been increasing ever since. So Berlin is not only back to pre-rent cap trend, but it's even above it. So prices are going up quite a lot. On the right-hand side, you see the unregulated segment, so properties built after 2014 that were not affected by this regulation, and their rents have just been going up, and they've been rising more than in other cities. If you look at the two of them together, well, you might already think there's a supply-side story there, because rents are going up a lot now in both segments, and one of the plausible reasons is there's just not that many apartments rented out anymore because of huge investor uncertainty. And this may be reflected in the rising prices. And because of that, my team and I looked at property prices, actually. And what you see here again is on the left side, the regulated segment, the right-hand side, the unregulated segment. And while rents have recovered quite fast, property prices in the regulated segment are still below trend. So there's still much of a discount for properties in Berlin compared to other cities. Meaning, well, investors are just not as willing to purchase apartments in Berlin anymore, because even though the rent cap is gone, the expectations are, or could be, that there's still an ongoing threat of regulation that is larger in other cities. So prices are just down. They have increased more in the unregulated segment. That's a bit more safer from future regulation, but especially regulated segment, I find them quite noticeable. And if you look at transactions, you see actually the same picture. So I also looked at advertising data. And what you see here is that there's actually less properties offered for rent, more properties offered for sale, because especially many smaller investors possibly don't want to keep their properties in Berlin anymore amidst this regulatory uncertainty. And this then in the aggregate leads to the dropping prices you can see here. So the rent cap has had in the long run effect on the property market in Berlin, just not on the rental segment, but on the prices of the regulated segment. So to sum this up, what you see is quite the bifurcation. So in the regulated segment, rents dropped. The demand got shifted to the unregulated segments where rents increased. They have been increasing quite strongly since the abolition of the rent cap. But at the same time, we have a lowered purchase price growth amidst the lower returns and amidst rising uncertainty for investors. And at the same time, we see a collapse in supply of rental apartments. There's just way less apartments offered for rent, with many more apartments offered for sale following the conversion, despite the lower prices. So all in all, we still have some ongoing effects, and it will be really interesting to see where this goes in the even longer run. All right, so I set this up quite a bit to be on time for the schedule, but I'm really happy also to get insights from you practitioners on all these topics. And I'm happy to discuss this with you.
Great, thank you. Are there any questions? If you have questions, just type them into the chat or in the Q&A. I have maybe as an icebreaker, your insights in the variant subsidy are quite clear. There was a 10,000 euro subsidy and that went directly into the prices. you showed that with the borders to Hesse or Württemberg. So could you see something like a second round effect? Because I mean, the second round effect could be that people see the rising prices in Bavaria and move 10 kilometers across the border where they can not benefit from the subsidy, but at least they can get maybe a cheaper house or whatever. Do you see some sort of arbitrage that they are even filtering into the next state?
Not much, actually. So the prices on the other side of the border still were not much impacted by this. So if you compare properties close to the border in Baden-Württemberg with properties a bit further away, there was not much of a differential price trend. I'm not sure about the longer run effects because the subsidy was only in place for 3 years. So if the subsidy had been in place for longer, I could imagine some arbitrage effects happening. I think for the short time, not much.
So what is your perspective for the red? Because I mean, in tax theory, there's always this competition idea that the states are making a competition and to get the best employees. In fact, what we saw after they opened the red a couple of years ago, all the states were increasing the reds, and now I think we have the only one, Thuringia, that has decreased for the first time. Is there some hope that there are cuts, or even considering your results, shall we hope for cuts?
That's a tough question. So we have seen the first state now decreasing the rate after lots of increases. But the thing is, German public finances are quite constrained at the moment. And the states don't have that much leeway to actually lower tax revenues. And RET is one of the very, very few taxes a state can set. But for the other source of revenue, they just have to go with whatever the federal level sets, and they get a share of it. So I would be slightly pessimistic that there's enough funds available, given that we're not at the best point of the business cycle, and not all sources of funding go well. Rent revenues are not looking too well because of the current situation in the property market. So I'm not too confident that there will be much going on. I mean, there's still the state of Hesse with its Hessengeld, which is framed as a rent reduction, but is actually more like a flat rate subsidies for households that are first-time buyers. So some stuff might be happening, probably more the targeted things. But I don't expect too much happening at a large scale, just of the current financing situation. Should we? Well, really depends on your perspective. So as an investor, both is great if the rate goes down. Because transaction quantities do go up. You can sell more. For you, it's great. And the prices are, can probably really increase prices if the rate goes down. For individual households, or if you have the policy aim of making houses more affordable, my hunch would be what you can do from the government side, do stuff that makes building houses easier. The rent goes to everybody, regardless of transactions or goes to for transactions. The subsidies go to everybody, regardless of whether you buy a property or build a property. And if you want to, make more properties affordable, you need more properties. So you really have to target building conditions and make that easier and not subsidize pre-existing properties. But that would be my hunch.
That's what I always thought, that we are framing the Baukindergeld wrongly, because it was not really Baukindergeld, it was Beikindergeld.
Yes. So there's few people who used this to actually construct new properties. It was not that large. I don't have the specific number in mind, but vast majority used it to build, to buy pre-existing properties.
Yeah. So maybe the last question from my end. In literature, you find pretty much criticism to rental caps, strong rental caps, how they were discussed in Berlin and tried in Berlin. But literature is much more, let's say, benign on rental breaks, some sort of second generation rental regulation. What is your view on these rental breaks compared to rental caps?
I say I fully agree with the literature. Rental rates have much less adverse consequences to just vast rental cap as in Berlin. So if you just lower the scope at which rents can increase, yes, that's not ideal for investors. We have some adverse side effects. There might be some reduction in buildings, but it's really not as much as if you just really cap rents at way below market. But I think if you look at German property policy, it's not only actual policy measures that affect prices, but also expectations. So in Berlin currently does not have a cap, but investors seem to be much more hesitant to spend as much on properties in Berlin as before, just because there's much more uncertainty in the Berlin market compared to other states where just know that there won't be a rental cap passed. So expectations also play a major role, and that's, I think, not covered enough in the public discourse.
Great, thank you very much. I'm very glad that you're in line with literature, so I don't need that to rewrite by it like this. Thank you very much. Any other questions from the audience? It seems you have covered pretty much, or they are scared. Too much expertise.
It seems to be something for
There's someone, you can read the chat, I think so.
By establishing government-backed construction finance investment fund to facilitate construction with the use of financing costs, alongside implementing a price cap of property sales, prove more effective than subsidies, could the strategy potentially influence property value and boost ownership rates? Oh, that's many questions in one. Typical economist's academic answer, it really depends on how this is structured. I'm really skeptical of price caps, to be honest, because that just leads to market distortions. And I mean, if you just implement price caps much below market level, people are just not going to sell, or it just also discourages investors and so on. So I'd go rather with, if you want to subsidize something, make sure it's targeted at newly constructed houses. If it's under government-backed construction finance investment fund, it depends how the investment fund is structured, but making construction easier, reducing construction costs is not only about financing costs, but actual cost of building. So we're back to regulatory costs, timing of building permits, and so on. So if we can address all those things that make construction more expensive and drive down the actual cost of constructing properties, that sure helps. That will affect property values, depending on the scale we do it at. So, of course, if there's much more supply on the market, because we were able to build more, this could, to some extent, drive down general prices, because there's just much more you can get in the market. And ownership rates, yes, if it becomes more easy to own a property and more easy to finance, I do think that stuff has a positive impact on ownership rates, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I think there's no further question around. Again, here, if you have another question, you can drop that first and we will reroute that to Carla Krolage. So thank you very much for presenting, for your insights. I'm happy that you joined University of Regensburg, and we're looking forward to new insights, especially on what you're doing on work from home too.